The rain drummed steadily against the windows of Claire's modest suburban home. She sat curled on the couch, clutching a steaming mug of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she stared into the amber liquid. Across from her, her husband Mark leaned forward in his chair, his brows knitted in concern. "I still can't believe she's gone," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her auburn hair fell in loose strands around her face, damp from the tears she'd been quietly shedding all evening. "It feels like the end of an era, like something's been torn out of my life." Mark reached out, his calloused hand resting gently on hers. "I know, Claire. Your grandma meant the world to you. She practically raised you after your mum." He trailed off, not wanting to stir more painful memories. "She did," Claire said, her voice cracking. "But she was always different, you know? Mysterious, secretive even. She'd tell me these strange stories about our family, about how we were chosen. I thought it was just her eccentric side showing, but sometimes it felt so real." Mark tilted his head. "Chosen? For what?" Claire shrugged, letting out a shaky laugh. "I don't know. She was obsessed with our family history, kept a lot of old books and trinkets in her study. She wouldn't even let me in there. I figured it was just her way of holding on to the past." "You two were close," Mark said softly. "And from what I saw, she loved you more than anything." Claire's eyes glistened as she nodded. "She did. She was strict, sure, but she was always there when I needed her. She used to say I reminded her of herself when she was young. That's why this." She motioned to the small wooden box on the coffee table, its brass latch gleaming under the dim light. This feels so heavy." Mark leaned forward, eyeing the box. "What's in it?" Claire hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. "I don't know. It was in her will. She said it was meant for me and no one else." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. "Didn't you say she was superstitious?" Claire let out a dry chuckle. "That's putting it mildly. She believed in all kinds of things. Family curses, protective charms, the works. I used to think it was endearing, but now I'm not so sure." Mark's tone softened. "It's just a keepsake, Claire. Something to remember her by." Claire sighed deeply, her fingers finally lifting the latch. The box creaked open, revealing a small ornate ring resting on a bed of faded velvet. Its design was intricate, twisting silver vines encircling a deep crimson gem that seemed to pulse faintly in the light. "Wow," Mark said, leaning closer. "That's beautiful. Did you ever see her wear it?" Claire shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the ring. "It feels familiar." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Familiar how?" "I don't know," Claire said, her voice barely audible. "It's like it's calling to me." Mark gave her a skeptical look. "You're probably just tired. It's been a long day." "Maybe," Claire murmured, though her gaze never left the ring. She reached out and hesitated before picking it up, feeling the cold metal against her skin. A shiver coursed through her as she slipped it onto her finger. Mark watched her, concerned. "You okay?" Claire nodded, but her voice sounded distant. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Deep within the gem, a faint flicker of light seemed to ignite, unnoticed by either of them, and in that moment, Claire's life began to change forever. Days turned into weeks, and life seemed to settle back into routine for Claire and Mark. Yet, beneath the surface, Claire felt a growing unease. It started with the dreams, vivid, haunting, and primal. In her dreams, she found herself in a dense moonlit forest. Shadows danced between the trees as she moved with eerie precision, her senses alive with the thrill of the hunt. The sound of her breathing echoed in the stillness, her heart pounding with an unfamiliar rhythm. She was tracking something, but what? She couldn't say. All she knew was the overwhelming need coursing through her veins, an insatiable hunger. Every time she awoke, drenched in sweat, the details of the hunt slipped away, leaving only fragments, the rush of adrenaline, the cool night air, the coppery taste on her tongue. "You've been having them again, haven't you?" Mark asked one morning as Claire sat at the kitchen table, staring into her untouched cup of coffee. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "Every night, Mark. It's the same dream. Me running through the woods, chasing something. I can't shake the feeling that it's more than just a dream." Mark leaned against the counter, his brow furrowed. "You've been under a lot of stress, Claire. Losing your grandma, dealing with everything afterward. It's bound to take a toll. Grief does strange things to the mind." Claire ran a hand through her hair, her fingers brushing the strands that now seemed duller, darker. "Maybe," she murmured, though deep down she wasn't so sure. Meals became an increasingly awkward affair. Claire found herself pushing her plate away more often than not, her appetite waning with each passing day. "You're barely eating," Mark said one evening as they sat at the dinner table. "You need to take care of yourself." "I know," Claire replied, forcing a smile. "I'm just not hungry lately. I think it's the dreams. They leave me feeling full, satisfied almost." Mark frowned, but shrugged. "Grief can mess with your appetite too. Just don't let it go on too long, okay?" As the days grew warmer, Claire began avoiding the sun. She found herself instinctively recoiling from the bright light, her skin tingling as though burned even by brief exposure. "Why the sunglasses?" Mark asked one sunny afternoon as Claire stepped into the backyard, her wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her face. "They help with the glare," Claire replied quickly. "It feels too bright lately. My eyes hurt." Mark laughed lightly. "You're turning into a vampire or something." Claire flinched at his words but forced a chuckle. "Yeah, maybe I am." Her mood began to shift in subtle but unsettling ways. Once patient and even-tempered, Claire found herself snapping at Mark over small things, a misplaced coffee mug, a forgotten errand. "I don't know what's gotten into you," Mark said one evening after a particularly heated argument. "You're not yourself, Claire. You've been different." "I'm sorry," Claire muttered, rubbing her temples. "I don't mean to be like this. I just feel so raw, like my nerves are on edge all the time." Mark softened, pulling her into a hug. "We'll get through this," he whispered. "I'm here for you." Claire closed her eyes, clinging to him, but even as she did, she felt the strange hunger stirring within her, a hunger that no amount of food could sate. Late one night, as Claire lay awake staring at the ceiling, she glanced at the ring still wrapped snugly around her finger. Its crimson gem seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She couldn't shake the feeling that the ring had something to do with everything she was experiencing. But what could she do? It wasn't like she could just take it off. Or maybe she didn't want to. And so the changes continued, subtle yet undeniable, drawing Claire further into the shadows of her new reality. The cool night air wrapped around Claire like a comforting shroud as she stepped out onto the empty city streets. The hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a stray dog were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Her thoughts swirled in her mind like a storm, loud and restless, as if they were trying to drown her. Mark had gone to bed hours ago, his patience wearing thin after another tense argument. She couldn't blame him. She'd been unbearable lately. She thought a walk might clear her head, might silence the strange voices that had been whispering at the edges of her consciousness. "Claire." The voice came again, faint but undeniable, like a shadow in her mind. She shook her head, trying to dispel it, but the whispers grew louder as she wandered deeper into the city's darkened streets. Her steps became dreamlike, her surroundings a blur. The streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, casting elongated shadows that moved like living things. Lost in her haze, she barely noticed the three figures stepping out from an alleyway, their faces obscured by hoods. "Well, well, what do we have here?" one of them sneered, his voice thick with malice. Claire stopped, her pulse quickening, though not from fear. She turned to face them, her hands tightening into fists. "Looks like an easy target," another muttered. "Hand over your bag, lady, and no one gets hurt." The third man, taller and bulkier than the others, stepped forward and grabbed her arm roughly. "We don't have all night." Something inside Claire snapped. A cold, sharp sensation rippled through her veins, and her vision sharpened. The whispers in her head grew louder, their words unintelligible but commanding. "Let go of me," she said, her voice low and unnervingly calm. The man holding her laughed. "Or what? You gonna—" He didn't finish. Claire moved faster than she thought possible, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist. The sickening crunch of bone breaking echoed in the narrow street as he screamed and fell to the ground, clutching his shattered arm. The other two lunged at her, but Claire spun with inhuman speed. She delivered a kick to one's chest, sending him flying into a nearby dumpster with a thud. The third man swung a knife at her, but she caught his wrist mid-air and twisted it, the blade clattering to the ground. In moments, all three attackers were incapacitated. The man by the dumpster groaned weakly, while the one with the broken wrist tried to crawl away. But Claire didn't care about them. Her eyes locked onto the third man, who now sat on the ground, clutching his face. Blood streamed between his fingers, staining his clothes and the concrete beneath him. Her breath hitched, and a strange primal hunger surged within her. The scent of blood was intoxicating, and the world around her faded into darkness. All she could see was him, his blood, his fear. Her body moved on its own, closing the distance between them. She could hear his heartbeat, fast and frantic, like a drumbeat driving her to madness. "Please," the man whimpered, but his voice was drowned out by the whispers in her head. Claire's teeth ached, her mouth watering as she crouched over him. She was inches away from his bloodied face, her lips parting as the hunger consumed her. "Claire!" A strong hand gripped her shoulder, yanking her back with such force that she stumbled. She turned, snarling, her vision still clouded with bloodlust, and found herself face to face with Mark. "Claire, what the hell are you doing?" he shouted, his voice panicked and full of disbelief. The world snapped back into focus. She looked down at her hands, stained with blood, and then at the terrified man on the ground. Horror washed over her as she staggered back, the whispers in her head fading into silence. I didn't," she stammered, her voice trembling. Mark grabbed her arms, shaking her gently. "We need to go. Now." Without another word, he pulled her away from the scene, the two of them disappearing into the shadows of the night. But Claire knew she couldn't run from what had just happened, or from the darkness growing inside her. Claire paced the living room, her arms crossed tightly, blood still smeared faintly on her clothes. Mark stood near the doorway, his face pale and lined with worry. The tension between them was as thick as the silence that stretched on. "What the hell was that tonight, Claire?" Mark finally broke the silence. "You could have killed those men." "They attacked me," she snapped, her voice sharp, defensive. "What was I supposed to do? Let them hurt me?" Mark's jaw tightened. "That wasn't self-defense," That was something else. Something wrong. You weren't just fighting them. You were enjoying it. Claire stopped, turning to face him, her eyes gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. You don't know what you're talking about. I think I do, Mark said, his voice trembling. His gaze dropped to her hand. It's the ring, Claire. Ever since you put it on, you've been different. Claire's hand instinctively covered the ring, as though shielding it from his words. The ring has nothing to do with this, she snarled, her voice guttural, almost unrecognizable. It's mine. I'll never take it off. Mark stepped back, stunned by the ferocity in her tone. Listen to yourself. You're not acting like you. You're not thinking clearly. Maybe you're the one who isn't thinking clearly, Claire growled. The ring is a part of me now. You wouldn't understand. As Mark tried to reason with her, Claire's words faded into the background, and the scene shifted. The year was 1954, and a storm raged outside a quaint countryside cottage. Inside, a woman in her early 30s stood by the fireplace, her fingers brushing over the ornate ring on her hand. Her striking resemblance to Claire was uncanny, though her face bore a haunted, weary expression. Lillian, her husband said softly, breaking the silence. He was tall, with kind eyes and a voice that carried both concern and authority. You've been staring at that thing for hours. What aren't you telling me? Lillian turned to him, her voice low and strained. This ring. It was given to me by my grandmother. She told me it's been passed down through generations. A legacy, she called it. But it's not just a family heirloom. It's something much darker. What do you mean, darker? He asked, stepping closer. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. The ring carries the essence of a spirit, a powerful, ancient entity. My grandmother warned me that I'm not strong enough to wear it, that its power would claim me if I did. Then why keep it? Her husband asked, frowning. Why not destroy it? Lillian's eyes darkened, her voice trembling. Destroying it would release her, and if we were to simply give it away, she would take over the first weak soul she could find. No one would be safe. Who is she? Her husband asked. His voice hushed. Lillian's gaze bore into him, her voice dropping to a whisper. She who dwells in the ring, a being so dark, so vile, that even in death she seeks to walk among the living again. Her husband shivered. Is there no way to end this? Lillian shook her head. The spirit feeds on those it claims, growing stronger, but there's a legend that one day someone strong enough will wear the ring and face her, defeat her. Only then will the curse be broken. And if they fail? He asked, dread seeping into his voice. She will walk this earth once more, Lillian said, her voice barely audible. The crackling fire dimmed and shadows deepened in the corners of the room. In the darkest corner, something moved. A figure emerged, barely visible in the flickering light, a decrepit old woman, her skin cracked and flaking, as if held together by dust and rot. Her white hair hung in matted clumps, and her eyes were voids of endless black. The air seemed to freeze as she tilted her head, watching Lillian with an unnatural stillness. A faint, rasping breath escaped her lips, carrying the scent of decay and death. She waits, Lillian whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Always watching, always waiting for her chance. The vision faded, and Claire's voice rang out once more, fierce and defiant. I'm fine, Mark. I don't need your help. I don't need anyone. Mark stared at her, his heart heavy with unease. He knew this wasn't over. Whatever the ring was, whatever it was doing to her, it was only the beginning. Claire drifted into sleep, her body tense, her mind clouded. The moment her eyes closed, She was transported back to her childhood. She was no more than 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on a patchwork quilt in her grandmother's cosy parlour. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting warm patterns on the wooden floor. Her grandmother, Lillian, sat across from her in a high-backed chair, her hands resting lightly on her lap. The ring glinted faintly on her finger, the crimson stone catching the light as though it had a life of its own. Young Claire tilted her head, her gaze fixed on the ring. "Grandma, why do you always wear that? It looks so heavy." Lillian smiled softly, though there was a shadow in her expression that Claire couldn't quite understand. "This ring, my dear, is more than just jewellery. It's a responsibility." "A responsibility?" Claire asked, wrinkling her nose in confusion. "Yes," Lillian said, leaning forward. "This ring has been passed down through our family for generations. It carries a story, a dangerous one, and it must never fall into the wrong hands." Claire's curiosity piqued, her small hands resting on her knees. "What kind of story?" Lillian reached out and gently took Claire's hands in hers. Her voice grew quieter, as though afraid of being overheard. "It's a story told best in rhyme. Would you like to hear it?" Claire nodded eagerly.
This crimson stone, so dark, so bright, holds blood of one who shuns the light. A vampire soul within does dwell, bound by curse, a shadow spell. The wearer gains both strength and speed, yet hungers for a darker need. Beware the whispers in the night, they lead the strong to endless fight. To end her reign, one heart must stand, of iron will and steady hand. The ring must burn in holy flame, to cleanse the world of her cursed name. But know the cost of this brave feat. Your soul shall face her dark deceit, for if you falter weak of heart, the spirit rises whole to start.
Claire listened, enraptured, her young mind struggling to grasp the weight of the words. "Who is she, Grandma? The one in the ring?" Lillian's smile faded. Her eyes grew distant, her voice heavy with memory. "She is the one who wishes to walk among the living again, an ancient vampire, bound to the ring by those who sought to stop her centuries ago, but her essence still lingers, feeding on the weak who wear it." "Then why do you wear it?" Claire asked, her brow furrowing. "Aren't you scared?" Lillian hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ring. "I wear it because someone must. The ring calls to people, Claire, and if it finds someone unprepared, it will consume them. My grandmother taught me how to resist it, how to keep the spirit at bay." "How?" Claire whispered, leaning closer. "The key is discipline," Lillian said firmly. "The spirit preys on those who are vulnerable, those who lack control over their desires, their emotions. I've spent my life learning to quiet my mind, to resist its whispers. It still tries, of course, but I have the strength to say no." Claire looked at her in awe. "Does that mean you're stronger than everyone else?" Lillian shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "Not stronger, just more prepared. But even I am not immune. The ring waits, always watching, for the moment I falter. That's why it's so important to be ready, because one day someone in our family will need to do more than resist. They'll need to end it." Claire's eyes widened. "End it? How?" Lillian's voice grew even softer, barely a whisper. "To destroy the ring is to face her, the vampire spirit inside. Only someone of unbreakable will can stand against her. If they succeed, the curse will be broken. But if they fail—" "What happens if they fail?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Lillian met her gaze, her eyes filled with quiet sorrow. "Then she will rise again, stronger than ever, free to walk this world and spread her darkness." The cosy parlour seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners deepening. In the darkest corner, a figure began to emerge, a frail, decrepit old woman, her skin cracked and flaking like dried parchment. Dust and rot clung to her as she moved silently, her hair hanging in matted white strands, her eyes, voids of endless black, fixed on Lillian with an unnatural hunger. "Who is she?" Claire whispered, clutching her grandmother's hand tightly. "She is the one who waits," Lillian replied, her voice shaking, "and she will keep waiting until someone strong enough can stop her." Claire awoke with a start, her breathing shallow, her hand instinctively clutching the ring on her finger. The rhyme echoed in her mind, and for the first time she understood the weight of what she was carrying and the danger that came with it. The morning sun filtered weakly through the curtains as Claire sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. Across from her, Mark watched her intently, concern etched into every line of his face. "I had another dream," Claire began, her voice unsteady. Mark raised an eyebrow. "The same as before? The forest?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "This was different. I was a child again, sitting with my grandmother. She taught me a rhyme about the ring. She said it holds the soul of a vampire, and that only someone strong enough can face her and end the curse." Mark leaned forward, his expression serious. "Do you remember the rhyme?" Claire nodded and recited it, her voice trembling. "This crimson stone, so dark, so bright, holds blood of one who shuns the light. A vampire's soul within does dwell, bound by curse, a shadow's spell. The wearer gains both strength and speed, yet hungers for a darker need. Beware the whispers in the night. They lead the strong to endless fight. To end her reign, one heart must stand, of iron will and steady hand. The ring must burn in holy flame, to cleanse the world of her cursed name. But know the cost of this brave feat. Your soul shall face her dark deceit. For if you falter, weak of heart, the spirit rises, whole to start." Mark rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Holy flame. It's clear we need fire, but this isn't just about throwing the ring into a bonfire, is it?" "No," Claire said. "Grandma said that the spirit feeds on weakness. If I'm not strong enough, she'll use me to return. But I think if we can confront her, distract her long enough, we can destroy her." "How do we even prepare for something like that?" Mark asked, his tone edged with disbelief. Claire's gaze was steely. "We follow the rhyme. We burn it in a fire, but not just any fire, a consecrated one, and we need to create a space where she can't escape if things go wrong." The next 2 days were spent in frantic preparation. Mark researched rituals of purification, gathering salt, candles, and holy water. Claire retrieved an old journal of her grandmother's, detailing ceremonies for binding and banishment. They chose the basement for the ritual, clearing the space and marking a circle on the floor with salt. Candles were placed at the cardinal points, their wicks steeped in holy oil. In the centre, they built a small pyre using consecrated wood. The night of the ceremony, Claire and Mark stood at the edge of the circle, their faces lit by the flickering flames of the candles. Claire held the ring in her hand, its crimson gem pulsing faintly as if it were alive. "Are you ready?" Mark asked, his voice low. "As ready as I'll ever be," Claire replied, stepping into the circle. Claire placed the ring on the pyre and lit it with a trembling hand. The flames roared to life, unnatural and fierce, casting shadows that danced around the room. The air grew heavy, the scent of burning metal filling their lungs. Suddenly, the fire twisted, and a figure began to emerge within the flames. It was the spirit, a decrepit old woman, her skin cracked and flaking, her black eyes glistening with malice. Dust and rot clung to her, her laughter echoing like a death rattle. "You fools," she rasped, her voice filled with cruel amusement. "Did you think you could destroy me? You've only freed me from my prison." Claire stepped back, her heart pounding as the spirit began to rise, her form solidifying. "I am older than your gods, stronger than your flames," the spirit sneered, "and now, thanks to you, I shall walk this world again." Mark shouted from outside the circle. "Claire, now, the final part." Claire's hand shook as she retrieved the small vial of holy water from her pocket. She hurled it into the flames, the liquid exploding into a brilliant white light. The spirit screamed, her form twisting and writhing as the fire turned blindingly bright. Claire recited the words from her grandmother's journal, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her heart. "Bound by curse, your reign shall end. In holy light, your soul I rend. No longer bound by crimson stone, your shadow fades. You're now alone." The spirit's screams grew louder, her body disintegrating into ash. For a moment, it seemed as if she would escape, her black eyes locking onto Claire. "You think you've won," the spirit hissed. "You'll never be rid of me. I am eternal." Before she could finish, the light consumed her entirely, leaving nothing but silence. Claire collapsed to her knees, the room falling still. The ring lay in the ashes of the pyre, its gem dull and lifeless. Mark rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms. "It's over," he said softly. Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's over." But deep in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit's final words were more than a threat. They were a promise. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp. Mark sat slumped on the sofa, his head resting against the cushion, his body finally relaxed for the first time in days. The faint sound of a late-night show played on the television, but he wasn't paying attention. His thoughts were elsewhere, replaying the horrors they had faced. "We're going to be all right now, Claire," he shouted toward the kitchen, a small smile breaking across his face. Relief swept over him like a wave. "It's over. We're finally free." The air grew still, unnaturally so, and the light in the room flickered. Mark's smile faltered as a cold wind began to seep through the house, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. "Claire," he called again, his voice tinged with unease. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut with deafening force, the locks clicking into place one by one. The windows rattled as if struck by a violent gale, though the air outside was calm. Mark shot to his feet, his heart pounding. "Claire!" he shouted, panic creeping into his voice. The wind intensified, swirling wildly around the room. Objects lifted off shelves and hurled through the air. Picture frames shattered, books thudded against the walls, and the lamp crashed to the floor. Mark shielded himself with his arms, stumbling back as the wind seemed to push against him, pinning him against the sofa. The kitchen door creaked open, and a shadowed figure stepped through. It was Claire, but something was different. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her posture unnaturally straight. The glow of the crimson gem on the ring cast an eerie light across her face, and her eyes. They were black, endless voids that seemed to swallow the room's light. "Claire," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. She tilted her head, a twisted smile curling on her lips. "Claire? No, my dear, she's not here anymore." Her voice was cold, hollow, and laced with cruel amusement. Mark's breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" "You denied me my legacy," she hissed, stepping closer, the air around her crackling with energy. "You destroyed my vessel, my ring, and for that I had to make other arrangements." She gestured to her body, the smile widening. "I have taken this one instead." Mark's legs gave out, and he stumbled backward, his back pressing against the sofa. No, this isn't possible. We destroyed you. The spirit laughed, a guttural, chilling sound that echoed through the room. You destroyed the ring, yes, but not me. I needed only a moment to find another, and this body is strong, perfect for my return. She leaned closer, her black eyes locking onto his. I will walk in your world once again. With a wave of her hand, an invisible force knocked Mark to the ground, pinning him flat. He struggled, but it was useless. Claire, if you're still in there, fight her. Please, he begged, his voice breaking. The spirit sneered. Claire is gone. But don't worry. She won't be alone for long. She crouched over Mark, her lips parting to reveal elongated, razor-sharp teeth. Mark screamed as she lunged forward, sinking her fangs into his neck. The sound of tearing flesh and his muffled cries filled the room, quickly fading as his body went limp. The house fell silent once more, the wind dying as quickly as it had risen. The doors unlocked themselves with soft clicks, and the air grew still. The figure that had once been Claire rose gracefully to her feet, her skin now pale and radiant, her eyes glowing faintly crimson. She ran her hands down her sides, relishing the vitality of her new body. Stepping over Mark's lifeless form, she moved towards the door. With every step, her movements grew more fluid, more confident. She opened the front door, inhaling deeply as the cool night air greeted her. Outside, the world was quiet, the streets empty. She took a single step into the night, spreading her arms wide as a triumphant smile lit her face. Life, she whispered, her voice filled with dark delight. She took another step, then another, her voice rising with every word. Life, life. Her laughter echoed through the streets as she disappeared into the shadows, leaving only silence and death in her wake. And so, the spirit of the ring walked among the living once again.